Happy New Year!
Would you like to save yourself 12 minutes per week of listening to ads like this?
Well, Club Retrospectors members get an ad-free feed on their podcast app, plus weekly bonus bits and freshly baked episodes every Sunday.
And right now, you can try being a member for free. Visit patreon.com/retrospectors for a week's free trial. Or click subscribe on Apple Podcasts for a 14-day free trial.
That's patreon.com/retrospectors or click subscribe in Apple Podcasts.
And hurry, because the offer ends January the 18th.
It's January 8th, 1833, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
It was today in history in 1833 that the 264 people eligible to vote in the sleepy seaside town of Lymington chose John Stewart as their MP, a man who on paper sounds like a typical member of the British 1930s elite, a wealthy plantation owner who had made his money on the brutal sugar farms of the British West Indies, but he was also, more surprisingly, the son of an enslaved woman, making him the man that many people consider to be Britain's first black MP.
It is really interesting because it's from a time where Parliament was sort of colourblind, in the sense there wasn't a rule about what colour you had to be in the UK, but there was a rule that you needed land. He had land because he inherited his father's land when his father died in the West Indies, and that qualified him. 1987 is often the year that people think that British MPs from ethnic minority backgrounds were elected for the first time. And here's one nearly 2 centuries earlier. He was an unrepentant slave owner because he was the illegitimate son of a plantation owner, John Stewart Sr., who himself had briefly been a Tory MP for Camelford for a few months in 1819 and was then disqualified from office over bribery and corruption.
Yeah, like many mixed heritage children of wealthy planters in the Caribbean, Stewart had been sent to Britain to be educated and to build a career within metropolitan society. And his family had immense wealth that had been derived from Caribbean plantations worked by enslaved people. And that gave him access to social networks that made his political career possible. But his background didn't, as you say, Olly, prevent him from moving into mainstream British public life at a time when racial attitudes were still deeply hierarchical. But because he had this immense wealth, that kind of gave him a free pass.
Yeah, I mean, this is before the scientific racism of the Victorian era. That's when race began to be treated as this sort of innate biological limitation for non-white people. You know, in this period, other races were still seen as inferior, but it was seen as cultural inferiority. And if you dressed European, acted European, if you spoke perfect English and you went to the right schools, you had a wealthy family, you were Christian, your race might be overlooked to a degree. Like, non-European heritage was an obstacle, but it was one that could be overcome. The more obvious obstacle that Stuart's race presented was that it marked him out as illegitimate, which was a huge social barrier, although it was very common in the West Indies. There were very few European women in the colonies, and it was kind of accepted with a blind eye that the British men out there would, you know, take wives, mistresses, consensually or non-consensually, from among the women enslaved on those plantations. And as you might possibly have seen coming, Stewart did not enter Parliament as a proud mixed-race man ready to champion the rights of enslaved and oppressed people of colour. He entered it as a plantation owner who just happened to have a kind of quirky heritage. And in Parliament, which he didn't appear very often, as many MPs at the time didn't, it was really seen as voluntary to actually participate, he was a vocal supporter of the rights of the plantation-owning classes. He opposed the abolition of slavery. He opposed import duties on sugar. And when slavery was ultimately abolished in 1833, it was initially replaced with a system of apprenticeship where former slaves would be turned into apprentices and have to work for free for another 4 to 6 years as a sort of transitional period. He also vocally opposed ending that.
Yeah, there's this really interesting distinction between the election campaign for this seat in Lymington, which he achieved today in history, and what happened when he then got into the House of Commons vis-a-vis slavery. So during the election campaign, he did have to actually defend his use of slaves, at least. It came up on the election trail. There were people who were anti-slavery in Britain in 1832. He had to deny there was cruelty on his estate and, you know, speak in opposition to people being treated cruelly. And yet once he's in the House, It's so ironic. I mean, one of the first significant things that Britain's first black MP did was to present a petition to the House of Commons against the freeing of slaves in the colonies. His race is completely ignored in documents of the time. A commercial gentleman of great respectability is how he's summed up by an encyclopedia of MPs. And when slavery was abolished, he didn't just campaign against that. He campaigned for compensation for himself and got it. £22,400 for his personal loss of 433 slaves. Not compensation, as people argue for now, for the slaves themselves or the nations those slaves had come from, but for the slave owners.
Yeah, and he still kept his estate along with Stewartville in the same colony and expanded his holdings by purchasing another property in 1839. He then brought in labourers from Madeira, and as a trustee of the Hopevale estate in Grenada, he later claimed to have owned the largest slave estate in Antigua between 1824 and 1826. So he was hugely unapologetic about what he had done and kept doing what he had always done even after the freeing of slaves. But by the 1850s, Stewart was deeply embedded in City of London business circles. He became a director of the British West India Company in 1846, and so just had this hugely high-flying business career built on the fact that his family had historically and into his lifetime been slave owners. So he he really wasn't, as you're saying, Olly, the sort of pin-up boy for this historical moment of the first non-white MP that we might have been expecting.
And he also possibly wasn't actually the first black MP either. If you go back even further in the House of Commons, there are examples of MPs that were from what we'd now term as an ethnic minority because they had a grandparent of African descent. But what's interesting is self-definition plays a huge part, isn't it? If any of those people were alive now and said, I am black, then that would define themselves as saying they're a person of colour. There may have been quite a few others.
Yeah, the earliest is James Townsend, who was a long-serving MP, first elected in 1767, also a Lord Mayor of London in his day. His grandmother was the daughter of a Dutch officer and an African woman, making him 1/8 black, but it's not clear if this ancestry was evident or known to those around him in Westminster. He certainly never alluded to it publicly. It was never mentioned in any accounts, so there's a possibility that people just didn't know. There's also Richard Beckford, elected in 1780. He served in 3 parliaments. His mother was possibly an enslaved woman, but Stewart is the first non-white MP whose black ancestor is definitively established by name. She was called Mary Duncan, and she was listed as being from Demerara in modern-day Guyana, home to one of the Stewart plantations, and quite likely where Stewart himself was born. But one interesting thing is that from 1841, Stewart was not actually alone in Parliament. That year, another mixed-race planter's son entered the House of Commons, Henry Redhead York, the MP for York, whose father was himself a mixed-race plantation owner in Barbuda. And in that same batch of incoming MPs was David Ochterlony Dyce Somber, who was the MP for Sudbury. He was the first Anglo-Indian MP. His father was the son of an English officer and an Indian woman. His mother was also of Eurasian descent, although it has to be said, he didn't last very long. He was a bit of a scoundrel. He'd be kicked out the next year for bribery and corruption, and his wife later had him declared insane.
Meanwhile, Scotland's first MP from an ethnic minority background is thought to be Peter McLagan, who represented Linlithgowshire from 1865 to 1893. He was a son of a Scottish enslaver and a black woman about whom very little is known. But he joined a group of male MPs who championed women's suffrage, earning them the name Suffragettes in Trousers, which I rather liked.
Well, this is the point. We didn't have universal suffrage, as we've covered on this show many times. Didn't have equality of suffrage until 1928. So if you look at it on that basis, then really, the record still stands, and it's important to say, it wasn't until 1987 that Britain did have 3 black MPs, Diane Abbott, Paul Boateng and Bernie Grant, who were elected for Labour then in that year, kind of, if you like, proudly self-defining as black by the whole general public.
Yeah, it's kind of strangely ironic that there was almost 100 years where there were no black MPs in the House of Commons, and that was because the end of slavery in the West Indies also basically closed off the one way for mixed-race people to get into the British elite and public life, by being born on these plantations to these white planters and being packed off to England to private schools and then, entering into the Westminster elite. And that generation who then came in the 1987 election, two of them, Diane Abbott and Bernie Grant, were children of Windrush migrants. So it was like there was this long period where there was no black representation, and it wasn't till the Windrush migration that representation comes up again.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable to think that Boris Johnson had 6 ethnic minority members in his cabinet, whereas the combined total of ethnic minority cabinet members ever before then was 5 put together, and he had 6. But they were all serving in Boris Johnson's cabinet, so no one's going to take that achievement too seriously.
Tomorrow.
Some modern commentators have compared it to the aftermath of Princess Diana's death.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.